Alright, I believe we have everything ready to get started, and so I'd like to start by welcoming everyone to this webinar, where we'll explore the topic of PCI compliance and Magecart web skimming attacks. So we'll try to be as focused as possible in exploring both these dimensions. First, looking at an overview of PCI DSS and some key implications for retailers regarding third-party risk. Then, by understanding Magecart web skimming attacks, their connection to PCI DSS and strategies to mitigate Magecart and ensure PCI compliance. I want to get started by letting you know that this webinar has been pre-recorded, so if you have any questions, you can reach out to us at hello@jscrambler.com and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Moving forward, I want to present our speakers for the day. Joining us we have Pedro Fortuna, who is the CTO and co-founder of Jscrambler, and Justin Gage, who is the principal consultant at Consult Hyperion. And I'll go right ahead and move the floor over to Justin so he can get us rolling on the topic of PCI DSS. Thanks for joining us, Justin, and feel free to take it away.
Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning from wherever you are in the world, and thank you to Jscrambler for having me on the webinar today. My name is Justin Gage, and I am a principal consultant with Consult Hyperion. I head up the delivery of our identity and privacy practice areas in North America, and I also have a background in PCI compliance, which is why we're here today. To start, for anyone not familiar with Consult Hyperion, I wanted to give a little background on who we are. We're a team of global strategic advisors and technical consultants with one office based in the UK, just outside of London, and the other in New York City. We advise leading brands around the world on the future of payments, identity, and transit fare collection. We assist our clients in understanding the evolving technical and business landscape in these domains to help them determine their strategy, build their roadmaps, and execute their plans. Really, at the core, we are technology experts. Our technical consulting team has a long track record of writing the technical specifications that underpin card and mobile payments. We've architected numerous leading services and systems in our core areas of expertise that often require high levels of security. We use our structured risk assessment methodology to help our clients understand the business risks presented by certain technological choices. And lastly, to complement our advisory and technical consulting capabilities, we have a research, development, and testing laboratory with deep expertise in mobile, cards, and cryptographic security. This includes things like prototyping, automated testing solutions, and mobile application penetration testing. And for a bit of context, here's just a quick look at some of our clients around the world that represent the payment networks, financial institutions, governments, transit operators, and technology providers. Okay, so we're here today to talk about PCI DSS, what it's all about, and in particular, the threat of online skimming to payment security. So, to start, what is PCI DSS? The Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS, is the global data security standard that any business of any size must adhere to in order to accept payment cards. It presents common sense steps that mirror security best practices. It provides a baseline of technical and operational requirements designed to protect account data. PCI DSS applies to all entities involved in payment card processing, including merchants, processors, acquirers, issuers, and service providers. PCI DSS also applies to any other entities that store, process, or transmit cardholder data and/or sensitive authentication data, regardless of whether they are involved in the actual payment transaction or not. The key phrase is common sense steps and security best practices. The intention here is to provide a baseline minimum set of standards that any organization storing, processing, or transmitting cardholder data needs to follow. Just like any compliance program, though, this should be considered an entry point, as there are always ways to go above and beyond to protect your customers. The other key concept you should understand, if you don't already, is what I mentioned before around the terms cardholder data and sensitive authentication data. Cardholder data includes the primary account number, commonly referred to as PAN, or the number on the front of your card, cardholder name, expiration date, and the service code. Sensitive authentication data includes full track data, or the Magecart data, or the equivalent data on the chip, the security code on the front or back of the card, and pins or pin blocks. Now, cardholder data can be stored under certain circumstances. Sensitive authentication data can never be stored. So, the standard is organized into a set of 12 requirements across 6 key areas that broadly cover best practices for managing a cardholder data environment through a combination of people, processes, and technology. The requirements focus on building and maintaining a secure network and systems, protecting cardholder data, maintaining a vulnerability management program, implementing strong access control measures, regularly monitoring and testing networks, and maintaining an information security policy. All of these concepts combined really are the core of a PCI DSS compliance program and are considered the minimum standard requirements. We won't go into much detail here on what's included in each section. However, there's lots of documentation available on the PCI Council website where you can read through more specific guidance in each of these sections. I will point out, though, in the second half of the webinar, Pedro will be talking in a bit of detail about requirement 11 and one of the sub-requirements here around change detection. The common theme with all these requirements is that there is no single bulletproof solution to protect cardholder data. It's really about having a layered defense and defense in depth that involves every aspect of the cardholder data environment, and any of these areas, from people, both internal and external to the organization, established processes, or technology, could be a weak link where cardholder data can be exposed. So now you understand the requirements. How are retailers expected to prove they meet these requirements? A PCI DSS compliance program focuses on 3 main things: assessing, reporting, and monitoring. The most important aspect is assessing compliance. This includes a variety of options depending on the size of the merchant and the type of payment processing that they are doing. Assessments can take on a few different forms. First is qualified security assessors, or QSA. These are companies that assist organizations in reviewing the security of its payments transaction systems, have trained personnel and processes to assess and validate compliance with PCI DSS. These are often companies who have been in the PCI requirements space for a very long time and have experienced people who know how to spot and find weaknesses in security programs. Next is the Approved Scanning Vendor, or ASV. These provide commercial software tools to perform certified vulnerability scans for systems. This can happen on an ongoing basis, and these scans need to be come up clean in order for it to be approved as valid for compliance. And the last is a self-assessment questionnaire, which is a validation tool for merchants and service providers who are not required to do on-site assessments. Different SAQs are specified for different business situations, for example, in-person payments versus e-commerce. Some of the physical environment requirements in the PCI DSS obviously don't apply in an e-commerce only merchant. So each merchant really needs to work with their acquiring financial institution or service provider to determine the assessment requirements that apply in their specific situation based on their payment processing volumes and what channels they process payments. Any compliance program also needs to include reporting, which is really an output of these assessments. Reporting proves that compliance and presents any evidence that the appropriate data protection controls are in place. This can also include if for any reason the environment cannot meet one of the requirements, there's potential to have compensating controls which go above and beyond the original requirement. Lastly, we have monitoring and alerting, which shows the organization has systems in place for auto alerting to constantly monitor the access and usage of cardholder data. So a program consists of those three things: assessing compliance, reporting, and monitoring on an ongoing basis. Again, as we talked about before with the requirements, these really are intended to be minimum expectations to maintain compliance. Assessments are required once per year, and when scans are required, they're often conducted quarterly, or only required to be conducted quarterly. But that may not be enough. So it's important for anyone handling cardholder data to maintain a vigilant approach to monitoring their environment, evolving their approach, and acting on new information. Attackers are constantly evolving their approaches, and if merchants only follow the minimum standards, this is when there's the highest likelihood for systems to be compromised. So, now that we've talked about the requirements and how to build an assessment program to comply with them, let's look at the role of third-party service providers and their impact on PCI. Third-party service providers have become a critical part of accepting payments for many organizations. Very few companies can build a completely homegrown payment system without relying on another party for some aspect of the payment experience, whether it's integrating a secure payment form, hosting services in a cloud environment, shopping cart integration, or numerous other components of the payment flow. The PCI Council has added some specific guidance to PCI DSS for third-party providers over the years. Most of this guidance spawned out of the various breaches seen in previous years at large retailers and merchants such as Target, Home Depot, TJX, and so on. You've heard about all of these big breaches, and they've been in the news quite a bit. Some of these were actually in compliance with PCI DSS, but one of their third-party service providers was not, or the attackers breached lower security systems at those third parties, which ended up jeopardizing the merchant in the end. This guidance focuses on making sure that anytime an outside party may have access to parts of the payment flow, there's a clear and documented understanding between all parties around which components of the cardholder data environment are handled by the third party and how they comply with the requirements of PCI DSS. So just as we saw attackers evolve their approach in physical environments, from physical devices to skim cards at a register, to then breaching a third party and installing software to skim cardholder data at the register, we're now seeing a similar shift with online skimming attacks and Magecart. There are potentially dozens of pieces of code being compiled on an e-commerce website, and the weak link of these one of those third parties can often be targeted in order to access customer cardholder data. At Consult Hyperion, we often see these weaknesses in the mobile application penetration testing that we do for our clients, when certain components or modules might be reused to save developers time, but really secure coding practices may not have been followed on that specific component that was reused, which again ends up compromising the rest of the application and in turn the merchant unintentionally. So now that we've got a baseline understanding of PCI DSS, what merchants need to do to be aware of in complying with PCI requirements. I'm going to pass it over to Pedro, who will explain a bit more in depth about the threats of Magecart attacks and what you can do to prevent and detect them.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Justin, for this great rundown of the complex topic of PCI DSS and compliance, which ends up being closely related to my own area of expertise. So I've been working in security for more than 15 years. The last 10, I've decided to focus on application security, code protection, and client-side security in general. And one of the biggest topics in client security today is definitely Magecart web skimming attacks. So some of you may have heard about Magecart. The name actually comes from attacks against Magento, the e-commerce software. But right now, Magecart is not only affecting Magento installations. It's affecting e-commerce websites all across the globe and can actually affect any website that handles credit card payments. So it's not a surprise that the PCI Council is asking merchants to be aware of this new type of cyber attack. There was also an alert back in August, specifically for retail and hospitality sector. And in May, there was another alert by the PCI Council because of the growth in Magecart web skimming attacks. But even if you've missed these alerts, you probably didn't miss some of the high-profile Magecart attacks that happened since 2018. Of course, there was the well-known attack on British Airways, which stole the credit card details of over 380,000 passengers. But in the last few months, companies like Macy's, Claire's, and Warner Music Group have also been breached by web skimming attacks. But what do we know about these attacks? A Magecart attack is part of a supply chain attack that performs digital credit card skimming, which is also known as formjacking. Magecart attacks were done initially by a single group, but eventually, as it became very profitable, many other groups started doing the same, and now there's a whole cybercriminal collective just going after the credit card information. So it's no wonder it's popular because it scales well. If the attackers manage to change the JavaScript file, they can basically inject arbitrary code into the page and do whatever they want, and it will affect all the users at once on that website. It's also popular because you don't have to affect the main website, the e-commerce shop. You can go after the weakest link, like the third-party vendors that are being used in the page, and leverage the fact that they might have fewer resources dedicated to security. And it will be generally easier to compromise those third parties than going after the main website. So a Magecart attack basically works like this. You have third-party code being inserted dynamically into the page. That code can dynamically add more code, so there's a chaining effect. You can also have iframes, and those iframes can bring more JavaScript into the mix. And if any of these are compromised, usually it means that the whole website is running injected arbitrary JavaScript. In which case of Magecart, it is usually a credit card skimmer. Once the attackers collect the data that they want, it usually sends the data out to a drop server running in some domain. In this case, coolestfonts.com. And the attackers are able to collect a large number of credit cards using this scheme. Because the success of a skimmer depends on its ability to remain hidden, attackers are using obfuscation techniques to conceal their malicious code, and even go as far as using defense mechanisms to avoid being detected by bots, which invalidates many of current Magecart detection techniques. And this explains why the average web skimming attack remains undetected for 22 days on average, which is far too long when we consider that in the case of the British Airways breach, there were 25,000 credit cards being stolen per day. And that's 18 per minute. So the time is the most important asset in a Magecart attack. Which brings us to the big question: how can companies prevent these attacks? Prevention is a difficult topic to discuss when it comes to web skimming. Companies should always follow good security practices, especially by trying to reduce the number of third-party scripts they use and vetting these third-party service providers. And if we look at PCI DSS requirements, we also see a series of recommendations that the PCI Council has highlighted as ways to prevent Magecart attacks. But the bottom line will always be the same. There are too many ways for attackers to inject their payload into a website. Like Justin mentioned, several merchants that were breached by attacks like Magecart were following these recommendations, and still they weren't able to prevent the attack. So prevention by itself is not enough to deal with Magecart. So if we go deep into the PCI DSS requirements and try to build on top of them, we'll see that companies also need to use techniques to monitor the network to detect signs of intrusions, and file integrity monitoring tools to detect unauthorized changes and alert of a possible attack. And when we detect a web skimmer in action, we must be able to block it in real time to contain the damage as best as possible. Because web skimmers are so evolved these days, effective mitigation means leveraging a combination of different techniques like sandboxing, poisoning detection, and DOM tamper detection. It also means being able to analyze JavaScript both statically and dynamically, and using the best possible deobfuscation techniques to uncover obfuscated skimmers. And another very important aspect is that this mitigation approach should include resilient code protection to prevent tampering attempts. Otherwise, the attackers could potentially bypass the detection. So this all means a change in mindset. Instead of focusing on prevention, there should be a focus on detection and mitigation.
As a security researcher, I've been actively engaged in understanding how these attacks work. But more important than that, I've been working on technical solutions that can help companies mitigate this type of attacks. And that led to this behavior-based Magecart mitigation approach that basically departs from the assumption that sooner or later your web application will be breached. There are simply too many ways in, considering the average number of dependencies that web applications have. So the approach becomes detecting and blocking a web skimmer at runtime. And the best approach for doing that is by monitoring the behavior of the code running inside the web application. So a web skimmer will always show signs of malicious activity. For example, if we see a live chat script running in a checkout page and accessing the payment form, then that's obviously a behavior that tells us that something is wrong. Or if we see a previously unseen script running in some or even all of our user sessions, that's certainly something that we'll want to investigate because it could potentially be a web skimmer. Or if we see data going out to an unknown domain, this might be a sign of potentially malicious activity. These are just a few basic examples, but I'll explore a couple of more advanced scenarios in a minute. Detecting is important, but even more important is the ability to block the malicious behavior. This is the only way to actually mitigate the web skimming attack. But for this to be effective, the blocking must be done in real time, regardless of the script that is showing that behavior or what browser and device is being used. It should also be granular because we want to be precise in blocking just the malicious behaviors. We don't want to block more than what we should. And finally, it should provide good actionable data for the incident response teams or for the SOC teams to understand where the attack came from and to do the final cleanup. Our solution, Webpage Integrity, is based on the principles that I've just presented. This solution puts a JavaScript agent in every user session, combines multiple detection and protecting techniques. We look for DOM changes, form hooking, code poisoning, suspicious network accesses, etc. It doesn't rely on detection signatures, but on detecting behaviors. So new forms of web skimming attacks are also detected. And finally, a very important aspect, it is the only solution in the market that includes resilient code protection, which makes the solution unique because it's the only one capable of defending itself from tampering attacks from the web skimmers. Now that I've covered how we handle detection, let's see how we block malicious activity. We use a strategy based on permission levels. So for the first level, we control whether or not a certain script is allowed to load or if it should be blocked. At the second level, we allow our customers to control the behaviors of scripts based on high-level assumptions about what they should do. And the third level, they have the finest grain of control of every tiny action that the script is performing. Let me give you some actual examples. For instance, as a user of Webpage Integrity, I would have the ability to block or alert if a script is installing an onSubmit event handler, which is very typical of web skimming attacks. I could also block any type of connection that tries to send data out to a previously unknown domain, or if specific methods are used to send that data out, like WebSockets. Blocking any script that does anything to a specific payment form, so we can actually set which scripts are allowed to touch the payment form and which scripts aren't allowed to do that. And by combining some of these rules, we can get to a point where we have a very strict control of the behavior that we allow in our website without breaking things or compromising the user experience. Moving on, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to mention one of our most recent success stories, which is a major airline that came to us for mitigating Magecart, basically wanting to prevent becoming the next British Airways. So they wanted to know if any of their scripts changed behavior and to have the ability of blocking any web skimming attempts. They wanted this to have minimal impact on the performance, as that is directly tied to their revenues. And finally, they wanted the ability to send information to their CM. They implemented Webpage Integrity successfully, using our behavior-based detection and behavior control to actively detect and mitigate any type of skimmer. And our approach passed all of their detection tests. They also use our inventory of scripts and network events to get a clear picture of their platform at any given time, and our dashboards allow them to quickly see any malicious behavior and where it comes from. We transitioned from a POC to a production environment without any hiccups, and they specifically mentioned the value of being able to easily integrate the solution with zero or minimal impact.
So in conclusion, retailers must be aware of how to mitigate web skimming attacks, especially because of the damage caused by a Magecart data breach. Attackers are taking advantage of third-party providers to launch Magecart supply chain attacks that can go undetected for weeks or even months, which allows them to collect thousands of credit cards. And because there are so many possible ways in, companies must look for behavior-based mitigation detecting and blocking the attack in real time. So this approach is in line with the PCI DSS recommendations and helps retailers increase their compliance with this standard. Well, this is it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin and Pedro, for your detailed explanation of this topic. I want to remind everyone that you'll receive an email with our info sheet on preventing Magecart attacks, which gives an in-depth explanation of what we discussed today. As I mentioned earlier, if you have any specific questions, feel free to reach out to us using the email you see here. And in case you'd like to discuss the possibility of doing a POC, send us an email over and we'll get back to you very soon. And that's it for me as well. I hope that everyone is staying safe out there, and I look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thanks everyone, and bye for now.